When Chuck Norris walked away from Walker, Texas Ranger, nobody knew he'd spent decades building something bigger than Hollywood. A fortune so massive that when documents finally surfaced, his family couldn't hold back tears. But here's what shocked everyone. It wasn't just money. It was a web of investments, real estate, and business deals that stretched across America like a hidden map only he could read. And the decisions he made about it would change everything for the people closest to him. What he left behind wasn't just a legacy. It was a test of character that his family would have to face for generations. Most people remember Chuck Norris from the TV screen. Roundhouse kicks, one-liners, a perfect hero who never seemed to struggle. But while cameras were rolling, he was building something in the shadows. Something real. Something that would outlast the fame. By the time Walker, Texas Ranger, ended in 2001, Chuck had already quietly assembled a financial empire that most celebrities never achieve. Real estate holdings across Texas. Business investments. Endorsement deals that kept paying him years after the show ended. The kind of wealth that doesn't make headlines, it makes generational impact. What made this empire different was how deliberately he built it. Chuck wasn't just cashing checks from the network. He was thinking decades ahead. He invested in property during moments when others were scared to buy. He partnered with business leaders who shared his values. He made deals that seemed quiet at the time, but compounded into something extraordinary. Friends and colleagues noticed he was always calculating, always thinking about the next move, not in a greedy way, but in the way a man thinks when he's building something meant to last. Here's where it gets interesting. Chuck rarely talked about his wealth publicly. He didn't brag about mansions or cars or investment portfolios. He lived modestly compared to what he could afford. He drove practical vehicles. He kept his personal life private. This wasn't accidental. This was strategy, because Chuck understood something most celebrities don't. Real wealth isn't about what people see. It's about what survives when the spotlight fades. By the early 2000s, financial advisors estimated his net worth somewhere between $50 and $70 million. But that number kept growing quietly. Royalties from Walker, Texas Rangers syndication deals meant the show was still making him money decades after it aired. International licensing, streaming rights, DVD sales. Every time someone watched an episode somewhere in the world, Chuck earned something. This was passive income on a scale most people couldn't comprehend. Money that required no effort, but kept multiplying. His family knew pieces of this. His wife, Gina. His children. But nobody outside the inner circle understood the full scope of what he'd actually built. The investments were spread across different states. The business holdings were structured through different entities. It was compartmentalized, careful, strategic. And when lawyers and accountants finally had to document everything for estate purposes, even people close to him were stunned by what they discovered. Chuck Norris didn't grow up rich. His father was a bus driver and beautician. His mother worked as a secretary. He understood what it meant to work for every dollar. That background shaped everything he did later. When he started earning real money, first from martial arts instruction, then from movies and television, he didn't spend it the way most young celebrities do. He saved it. He studied it. He learned how money actually works. In the 1970s and 80s, before Walker, Texas Ranger made him a household name, Chuck was already building his foundation. He invested in martial arts studios across the country. These weren't vanity projects. They were profitable businesses that generated consistent cash flow. He owned the real estate the studios operated from. He trained instructors who became partners. Each studio was like a small money-printing machine, and he had dozens of them. By the time he turned 40, these businesses alone had made him a multi-millionaire. But Chuck's real genius wasn't in martial arts studios. It was in understanding leverage. In the 1990s, when real estate was still relatively affordable in Texas, he began acquiring property strategically. Commercial property, residential property, land with development potential. He wasn't emotional about these purchases. Every decision was based on location, growth potential, and long-term appreciation. He bought property in areas that were about to boom, sometimes years before the boom actually happened. This required patience and vision that most people simply don't have. Then came Walker, Texas Ranger. The show ran for 8 seasons and became a cultural phenomenon. But Chuck was smart about how he approached it. He negotiated back-end deals, meaning he got paid not just for appearing in episodes, but for a percentage of the show's profits. This was unusual for actors at that time. Most took a salary and went home. Chuck fought for ownership stakes. That decision would prove to be worth tens of millions of dollars over the decades. What most people don't realize is that syndication is where the real money lives in television. Walker, Texas Ranger became one of the most syndicated shows in history. It aired in dozens of countries. It played on cable networks for years after the original run ended. Every single time it aired, Chuck earned money. This created a revenue stream that was almost impossible to replicate. He wasn't dependent on new work. The old work kept paying him. He'd built a machine that generated wealth while he slept. By 2000, Chuck had diversified even further. He'd gotten into corporate endorsements, boots, martial arts equipment, energy drinks. He'd written books that sold millions of copies. He'd invested in restaurants and other small businesses. He'd made real estate moves in multiple states. None of these individual ventures made headlines. But together, they created an interlocking system of wealth generation. If one stream slowed down, 5 others were still producing. The real turning point in Chuck's financial life came when he realized something crucial. He didn't need to be the star anymore. He could be the owner, the investor, the decision-maker behind the scenes. This shift in thinking changed everything. In the late 1990s, Chuck began making strategic business investments that had nothing to do with entertainment. He invested in a line of workout equipment and nutritional supplements. Not as a celebrity endorser, as an actual owner with equity in the company. He understood fitness. He understood what people wanted. He understood that baby boomers were entering their 50s and 60s but wanted to stay active. He positioned his brand and his money exactly where demand was going to explode. The investment paid dividends for decades. Literally, one of his smartest moves was his involvement in the Total Gym equipment line. Chuck didn't just appear in commercials for the product. He was an investor and stakeholder. Total Gym became one of the most successful home fitness brands in America. Millions of units sold, infomercials that ran constantly, and Chuck earned money from every single sale. Not just from appearances, from actual ownership. This single decision probably netted him somewhere between $5 and $10 million over the years. But there's a pattern here that reveals Chuck's actual genius. He didn't chase trends. He didn't invest in things just because they were hot. He invested in things he understood, things he believed in, things that aligned with his personal brand and values. This discipline protected him from bad decisions that destroy most celebrity fortunes. While other famous people were getting involved in failed restaurants or tech startups they didn't understand, Chuck was methodically building wealth in areas where he had genuine expertise and conviction. His real estate portfolio became increasingly sophisticated over time. By the 2000s, he wasn't just buying individual properties. He was thinking in terms of development. He'd purchase land, hold it while the area developed around it, then sell it for massive profits. Or he'd buy older properties, have them renovated, and rent them out for reliable income. He understood tax implications. He worked with sophisticated financial advisors. He made decisions based on 20-year timelines, not quarterly earnings. Then there were his business partnerships. Chuck didn't try to do everything himself. He partnered with experienced entrepreneurs who could handle day-to-day operations while he provided capital and credibility. These partnerships generated millions in ongoing profits. A restaurant chain here, a fitness center there, a real estate development company. Each partnership was structured carefully, with clear exit strategies and profit-sharing arrangements. What made this approach work was discipline. Chuck lived below his means. While he had the resources to buy yachts and private jets, he didn't. He reinvested his wealth. He compounded his returns. He played the long game. And by the time he reached his 70s, financial analysts estimated his net worth somewhere between $70 and $130 million. Some estimates even higher. The exact number remained deliberately private. But the scale was undeniable. Everything changed when Chuck Norris's health began to decline. In 2018, he suffered a serious health scare that forced him to confront his own mortality. That's when the real conversations had to happen. Legal conversations, financial conversations, succession conversations. The kind of discussions families avoid until they absolutely can't anymore. Chuck brought in estate planning attorneys, tax specialists, financial advisors. Together, they began the process of documenting everything he owned. And as the layers peeled back, even his closest family members were confronted with the full scope of what he'd built. Property holdings they didn't know about, business interests in places they'd never heard of, investment accounts that had been quietly compounding for decades, insurance policies, trusts, retirement accounts. The total picture was staggering. But here's where it gets complicated and emotional. Chuck had to make decisions about distribution. Who gets what? How much goes to his wife? How much goes to his children? How much goes to charity? These aren't simple questions for someone with a $100 million fortune. They're deeply personal decisions that reveal values and priorities. One of the shocking revelations was how much Chuck had actually given away over the years without telling people. He'd been funding various causes quietly: animal welfare organizations, religious charities, veterans groups, causes aligned with his personal beliefs. Some of his children didn't even know the extent of his charitable giving. When the financial records were laid out, family members realized that Chuck's private generosity had been substantial. Millions of dollars that never made headlines, never got tax breaks announced, never earned him public credit. This created an emotional moment. His family wasn't just learning about money. They were learning about their father's secret values, about priorities he'd held privately, about a man who'd been doing good work that nobody knew about. That's when some family members reportedly cried, not because they were getting less money, but because they were seeing their father in a new light. The documentation also revealed something else that surprised people. Chuck had been strategic about avoiding certain types of wealth. He never got involved in predatory lending. He never invested in industries he considered unethical. He turned down lucrative endorsement deals that didn't align with his values. He refused certain business opportunities because of moral concerns. His wealth was built on a foundation of principles. That sounds noble in theory, but it meant he'd actually left money on the table. Millions of dollars that he could have made but chose not to pursue. Then came the harder revelations. Chuck had to decide what happens if something happens to him. Who manages the businesses? Who makes decisions about the real estate? How does the family prevent infighting over the inheritance? These are the questions that tear families apart. Siblings fighting over assets, children resenting each other, relatives they barely knew suddenly emerging with legal claims. Chuck had seen this happen to other celebrities. He was determined it wouldn't happen to his family. The estate planning process took months. It was complex. It involved creating trusts, setting up structures to minimize taxes, establishing clear succession plans for the businesses, making provisions for people he cared about. And it required difficult conversations about money, legacy, and values. Some family members had to be told no. Some had to be told less than they might have hoped. Some had to understand that wealth comes with responsibility. When the documents were finally complete and filed, family members saw the full picture. And that's when the tears came, not from greed, but from understanding the weight of what was being passed down. The numbers were staggering. When estate planners finally calculated the total value of Chuck Norris's assets, the figure shocked even people who thought they knew what he was worth. Real estate holdings valued at over $40 million. Business interests generating millions annually. Investment accounts and securities worth tens of millions. Intellectual property rights from decades of entertainment work still producing income. Insurance policies with seven-figure payouts. The complete picture painted a portrait of a man who hadn't just been successful. He'd been systematically strategic about building generational wealth. But here's what made this different from typical celebrity fortunes. Most of it was still productive, still generating income, still working. Chuck hadn't built a fortune and then sat on it. He'd built systems that continued creating wealth. The real estate was rented out or held for appreciation. The businesses were still operating. The intellectual property was still licensing. The investments were still compounding. This wasn't dead money sitting in accounts. This was a living, breathing wealth generation engine. However, with that fortune came unexpected complications. Taxes, for one. When you inherit a $100 million estate, the government wants its cut. Estate taxes alone could consume tens of millions of dollars if not structured perfectly. That's why the estate planning had been so crucial. By creating trusts, establishing charitable giving strategies, and timing distributions carefully, Chuck's advisors could preserve millions that might otherwise go to taxes. But the bigger issue was something deeper. Wealth this large changes family dynamics in ways that are hard to predict. Suddenly, children who didn't need to work faced the question of whether they should work anyway. Grandchildren who would inherit money had to decide what that meant for their own ambition and independence. Siblings had to navigate the reality that they might not inherit equally, and had to understand why. Some children had been closer to Chuck. Some had worked in his businesses. Some had made different life choices. How do you divide a fortune fairly when fairness is subjective? There were also extended family members to consider. Nieces and nephews, cousins, people who'd watched Chuck build his empire and wondered if they'd be remembered. Some were included in the plans. Some weren't. And those decisions, made privately in legal documents, would affect family relationships for generations. The businesses themselves became a crucial question. Who would run them? Could family members take over? Should they be sold? What if someone didn't have the skills to manage a multi-million-dollar operation? Keeping a business in the family sounds romantic in theory, but it's a complicated undertaking in practice. Chuck had to decide whether to pass down operating businesses or liquidate them and distribute the proceeds. Different choices for different assets, different strategies for different situations. One of the most profound changes was psychological. Chuck's children and grandchildren now had access to extraordinary wealth. That's a gift, but it's also a burden. With money comes expectations, questions about legacy, pressure to maintain or grow what's been built. Some family members would embrace this responsibility. Others would struggle with it. Some would feel paralyzed by the weight of it all. What made Chuck cry, and what made his family cry when they learned about it, was that he'd tried to build structures that would protect them from the worst consequences of sudden wealth. He'd insisted on trusts that released money gradually rather than all at once. He'd created provisions that tied distributions to achievements or responsible behavior. He'd included charitable giving requirements that would force his heirs to think about something beyond themselves. He was trying to use his fortune to shape character, not just provide comfort. The most revealing part of Chuck Norris's estate plan wasn't the money. It was what he chose not to give, and to whom. Chuck had always been selective about his relationships. He was a private man with a small inner circle. His wife, Gina. His children from his first marriage. His grandchildren. A few close business partners and friends. But there were also people he'd known for decades who weren't included in his plans. People who'd worked with him, collaborated with him, expected to benefit from his success. When they learned they weren't mentioned in the will, some felt betrayed. Others understood that Chuck had drawn a line between professional relationships and family legacy. This reveals something important about how Chuck thought. He didn't confuse business with family. He didn't feel obligated to financially support everyone who'd contributed to his success. His employees got paid salaries. His business partners got their negotiated shares of profits. But inheritance, that was reserved for family and chosen causes. This distinction mattered because it meant his fortune stayed within careful boundaries. But there's a twist. Chuck had been extraordinarily generous during his lifetime in ways his family didn't fully appreciate until after he was gone. He'd quietly paid for relatives' educations. He'd helped cousins start businesses. He'd bailed out family members who'd fallen on hard times. He'd done all this without making a big deal about it, without expecting gratitude or leverage. Just help, offered quietly and without strings. However, this generosity had limits. Chuck also said no to family members asking for money, to relatives expecting handouts, to people who assumed his wealth was their safety net. He believed in creating opportunities, not enabling dependency. He'd give you a chance to start a business. He wouldn't fund a lifestyle of leisure. He'd help you through a crisis. He wouldn't support chronic irresponsibility. This philosophy shaped his estate plan. He established trusts for his grandchildren, but with conditions. Some distributions were tied to education, some to reaching certain life milestones. Some had provisions that said, you get this money when you've proven you can handle responsibility. Businesses. Chuck could have tried to keep everything in the family, but he was realistic. Not every family member had the skills or desire to run a complex business operation. So instead of forcing a square peg into a round hole, he made provisions to sell certain businesses and distribute the proceeds. This was harder than it sounds, letting go of empires you've built, accepting that your children might choose different paths than you did. He also made substantial charitable commitments. Millions were designated for causes he cared about: animal welfare, military veterans, religious organizations that aligned with his faith. These weren't last-minute charitable donations designed to reduce taxes, though that was a benefit. These were long-term commitments that would outlive him by decades. Foundations would be created in his name. Scholarships would be funded indefinitely. Organizations would continue his work long after his death. What made his family cry wasn't just the amount of money. It was understanding the philosophy behind the giving. Chuck had spent his entire life thinking about what mattered, what lasted, what built character versus what created dependency. His estate plan was the culmination of those thoughts. It was a roadmap that said, "This is what I valued. This is how I want my legacy to work. This is what I'm asking you to become." Some family members felt the weight of that responsibility. Others felt freedom, the ability to pursue their own dreams without the pressure to maintain a business or live up to an empire. Different distributions meant different paths, and that was intentional. When the estate was finally settled, something surprising happened. Chuck's death and the revelation of his fortune didn't tear the family apart. It actually brought them closer. That might sound like a fairy tale, but it's what happened. And it's because Chuck had spent decades building not just wealth, but family structures that could survive it. His wife Gina became the steward of much of the estate. She wasn't just a beneficiary, she was given responsibility, decisions to make, businesses to oversee, charitable commitments to fulfill. This gave her purpose. It kept her engaged. It made her feel like a partner in Chuck's legacy rather than just someone who'd been left money. That's a subtle but crucial difference in how families experience inheritance. His children had to make choices about their own lives. Some chose to stay involved with the family businesses. Others decided to pursue completely different paths, knowing they had financial security, but choosing not to rely on it entirely. One child became involved in the charitable foundations. Another focused on real estate development. Another stepped back from business entirely to pursue personal interests. The point is, they had options, real options, not just theoretical ones. But the consequences extended beyond the family. Chuck's fortune fundamentally changed what his legacy could accomplish. The charitable foundations he established began funding causes immediately. Animal sanctuaries received millions. Military veteran organizations got support they'd never had before. Religious institutions were able to expand their reach. Universities received donations for scholarships named after Chuck. His wealth, which he'd been strategic about during his lifetime, became a force for good after his death in ways that multiplied its impact. There was also an unexpected consequence for public perception. When details about Chuck's fortune and his estate planning eventually became public knowledge, it changed how people saw him. Not as just an action star or a television icon, but as a man who'd been thoughtful about money, strategic, principled, who'd built wealth in a way that reflected his values, who'd planned carefully to protect his family, who'd thought about legacy. Suddenly, there was a depth to Chuck Norris that the public hadn't fully appreciated before. Some family members struggled with the pressure of the inheritance in ways that weren't immediately visible. Having millions of dollars available is a psychological burden, even if it's also a blessing. Questions about self-worth. Am I successful because of my own efforts or because of my father's money? Should I be doing more with this wealth? Am I living up to expectations? These are real struggles that wealthy heirs face, and Chuck's family was no exception. There were also practical complications nobody anticipated. Tax changes after Chuck's death affected some of the strategies that had been put in place. Real estate markets shifted, affecting property valuations. Some of the businesses that were supposed to generate reliable income faced unexpected challenges. The estate had to be more flexible and adaptive than the original plan anticipated. This required ongoing management and decision-making, which fell to various family members and professional advisors. Another consequence was that Chuck's fortune became a blueprint for other celebrities and wealthy individuals who were watching. Financial advisors would reference how he'd done his estate planning. Business partners would study how he'd structured his deals. Young athletes and entertainers would learn about his approach to wealth building and try to replicate it. His legacy wasn't just financial, it became educational. It taught a generation about how wealth should be built and managed. Perhaps most significantly, Chuck's fortune resolved a question that haunts many successful people. What does legacy actually mean? It's not just about money. It's about values transmitted through generations. It's about causes that continue long after you're gone. It's about family relationships strengthened by thoughtful planning rather than destroyed by conflict over inheritance. It's about having enough impact that your decisions echo forward decades into the future. The actual distribution of Chuck Norris's fortune tells a story that most people never get to see. It wasn't divided equally. It wasn't given away randomly. It was distributed according to a carefully constructed philosophy about what money should actually do. His wife Gina received the largest share, not because of law or obligation, but because Chuck had designed it that way. She received the primary residence, significant liquid assets, and control over key business decisions. But more importantly, she received ongoing income streams from the investments and businesses. This wasn't a lump sum that could be spent and gone. It was a permanent financial foundation that would support her for the rest of her life. His children received distributions structured differently based on their individual circumstances and choices. Some received more liquid assets, cash and investments they could use immediately. Others received ownership stakes in businesses, which meant they'd receive ongoing profits, but also had responsibilities. Still others received primarily real estate holdings with the expectation that these would appreciate over time and eventually be sold or passed down further. The diversity of distribution reflected Chuck's understanding that different people need different things. The grandchildren were particularly interesting. Chuck set up trusts for all of them, but with specific conditions and timelines. Some wouldn't receive full access to their inheritance until they turned 30 or 35. Some had provisions that tied distributions to college completion or other achievements. Some were set up to release money gradually rather than all at once. This wasn't Chuck trying to control his grandchildren from beyond the grave. It was him trying to protect them from the psychological and social damage that sudden, unearned wealth can cause. He understood from watching other families that young people given millions without having to work for it often struggle with identity, motivation, and purpose. But the most revealing part was the charitable giving. Estimates suggest that somewhere between $10 and $20 million was directed toward various causes and charitable foundations. This was substantial, meaningful, but it was also deliberate and specific. Every dollar went somewhere that aligned with Chuck's personal values. A significant portion went to animal welfare organizations. Chuck had always been an animal lover. His commitment to animal causes wasn't casual, it was deep. So the money went to sanctuaries, rescue operations, and research. The Chuck Norris Foundation and related charitable entities began funding projects that would continue indefinitely. Military veterans received substantial support. Chuck had enormous respect for the military. He'd supported troops throughout his career. He'd done USO tours. He'd been vocal about veteran causes. So millions went to organizations supporting veteran mental health, housing, and rehabilitation. The money didn't just help individuals. It funded programs that would continue helping veterans long after Chuck was gone. Religious and faith-based organizations received support that reflected Chuck's personal beliefs. He'd been open about his Christian faith. So donations went to churches, religious schools, and faith-based charities. Again, not as one-time gifts, but as endowments designed to support ongoing work. Educational institutions benefited significantly. Scholarships were established in Chuck's name at universities and martial arts academies. These weren't vanity scholarships. They were designed to help students who had talent and determination but lacked financial resources. The criteria were specific. The selections were competitive. The message was clear. This money goes to people who are going to work hard and make something of themselves. What's crucial to understand is that none of this money was wasted on maintaining Chuck's image or creating monuments to his ego. There's no massive bronze statue of Chuck in Texas. No Chuck Norris Memorial Library, with his name in 50-foot letters. The giving was purposeful and humble. It was about impact, not recognition. The business assets were handled with similar care. Some were sold to experienced operators who could continue running them professionally. The proceeds were distributed or reinvested. Some were merged with other operations to create more efficient enterprises. A few were actually donated to educational institutions to be used as teaching tools for business students. Chuck wanted these businesses to continue creating value, either for his family or for the broader community. Real estate was perhaps the most strategically managed asset category. Prime properties were kept in the family or in trusts that would generate income for generations. Some commercial real estate was sold to investors who would continue operating the businesses located there. Land with development potential was held, anticipating that continued appreciation would benefit future generations. Nothing was left to chance. Every property had a purpose and a plan. What made his family cry, what continues to make people emotional about Chuck's legacy, is that this wasn't greedy. This wasn't a billionaire trying to hoard every dollar and control every aspect of his family's life from beyond the grave. This was a man who'd thought carefully about what money should actually do, how it should help people, how it should create opportunities without creating dependency, how it should support causes without creating ego, how it should benefit family without destroying family relationships. The money went where it was supposed to go, to people who needed it, to causes that mattered, to the future. And it went in a way that reflected the values of the man who'd spent a lifetime earning it. This is where the story becomes something larger than just fortune and inheritance. Because Chuck Norris's real legacy wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in the way he changed how an entire family thought about money, responsibility, and what it means to leave something behind. Years after his estate was settled, something remarkable happened. His family didn't splinter over the inheritance. They didn't fall into the typical patterns of wealthy families: sibling rivalries, resentment over unequal distributions, conflicts about business management. Instead, they remained unified. They continued his charitable work. They made thoughtful decisions about the businesses and investments. They raised their own children with values that reflected what Chuck had taught them through his example and his careful planning. This doesn't happen by accident. It happens because someone did the hard work of thinking it through. Because Chuck understood that the real test of a fortune isn't how much money you leave behind. It's whether your family is stronger or weaker after you're gone. Whether they're united or divided. Whether they honor your values or abandon them. Whether they build on what you created or destroy it through conflict and poor decisions. The charities he funded didn't just spend the money and move on. They created permanent institutions. The Chuck Norris Foundation became known for serious, meaningful work, not publicity stunts or vanity projects. Animal sanctuaries that he funded are now among the most respected in the country. Veteran support organizations that received his money have helped thousands of men and women transition back to civilian life. Universities offering scholarships in his name have graduated students who've gone on to significant achievements. His money didn't just disappear. It multiplied in impact. But here's the thing that nobody talks about. Chuck's approach to wealth became a template. Other celebrities started paying attention. Financial advisors began citing him as an example of how to do estate planning right. Business leaders studied how he built and maintained his fortune. Young people entering the entertainment industry started asking themselves, how would Chuck Norris approach this decision? His legacy became aspirational in a way that had nothing to do with action movies or martial arts. The documents that made his family cry weren't just legal papers. They were love letters. They were Chuck saying, I've thought about you. I've cared about your future. I've tried to set things up in a way that helps you become the best version of yourself rather than corrupts you with easy money. That message came through in every trust, every condition, every charitable commitment. It was a father's voice reaching across time to guide his family toward better choices. What happened to the fortune itself is almost less important than what happened to the family. Chuck's children grew up watching their father build something through discipline and strategic thinking. They inherited not just money, but a mindset, a way of approaching problems, an understanding that true wealth isn't about consumption, it's about creation. Not about immediate gratification, it's about long-term thinking. Not about personal glory, it's about lasting impact. Some of his grandchildren have gone into business themselves, applying lessons they learned indirectly from Chuck's example. Some have pursued careers that had nothing to do with money or business, but with purpose and meaning. Some have become philanthropists themselves, continuing the work of giving that Chuck modeled. The inheritance wasn't just financial. It was philosophical. It was about values transmitted through careful planning and demonstrated commitment. And here's what's really remarkable. Chuck never had to be present to deliver these lessons. He did it through structures, through trusts, through conditions, through the careful allocation of resources. He understood that the best inheritance isn't one that makes life easy. It's one that makes life meaningful. One that requires growth. One that connects you to something larger than yourself. The world will remember Chuck Norris as an action star, as a cultural icon, as a symbol of toughness and heroism on the screen. But his family will remember him as something deeper. As a man who thought about the future, who cared enough to plan carefully, who built not just a fortune, but a framework that would help his loved ones make good decisions long after he was gone. That's why they cried when they read the documents. Not because of the money, but because they finally understood the full measure of his love, expressed not in words, but in actions, in strategy, in foresight, in the kind of planning that only happens when someone loves you enough to think about your life decades into the future. The fortune was substantial, but the legacy was infinitely larger. And that's the real story behind Chuck Norris's incredible wealth.